And thank you for introducing me and for inviting me to participate in this important workshop, because I think that at this stage, this model really shows huge potential. And my opinion is that this model should also be set against policy issues that lie before us, in the sense that for every policy issue that we have looked at, we should understand if the techniques we are using will produce an original output or not. So today we have a great concern, which is related to the fact that people's jobs are increasingly intermittent. So we are going to have future pensioners who are going to have had occupational careers that are very fragmented. So does the MOSPI system consider all these interruptions, people that come and go from the labor market? There are interruptions in contributions, and how is it going to consider these aspects? So to what extent the actual functioning of the labor market is modeled, or the employment rate for the coming 20 years, is it considered as an exogenous scenario data, or is it part of this model? And again, what about birth rates? What is going to be the impact? No doubt is one of the factors that is going to have an impact on the future labor market in 20-25 years from now. We are going to have cohorts that are going to be smaller and smaller cohorts of workers. So the MOSPI model is it going to make forecasts that are based on certain data, or is it going to consider, for instance, the fact that households where couples don't have children, why this happens, or the issue of retirement age? Well, in that case, in principle, we perhaps need to know at what age people would retire if they were, free to choose. Well, we cannot do that. One of the ways consists in having them interact with the data builders. So the Silk survey or database may include such questions. Do you think you can interact with Silk and ask them to introduce such questions? So if you had sort of to consider requests, what are the most urgent based on the database you have? What improvements can be introduced in this database that could be useful? And another essential issue is the adequacy, responsiveness to the needs of the elderly. So the risk of poverty up until today was estimated. So at risk of poverty is what we have calculated so far, but we also need to consider an absolute risk of poverty, considering that the basket of elderly people is different compared with that of young people. And that in part, particularly in the last years of one's life, there is a chance of people ending up in long-term care institutes. So a very steep increase in daily expenses for the elderly, particularly those above 80 or 90 years of age. So these are the aspects I'm curious about in terms of the strategies adopted, and I would like to know what are the main policy issues, according to you, that could be addressed by resorting to this model. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. And here too, I would like to attempt providing some answers, then asking Stefano if he wishes to add something. First of all, as far as intermittent careers are concerned, well, the MOSPI line consists precisely in identifying people with intermittent careers and deal with the future of work issue, so innovative occupational forms. And within the model, the TD model, employment rate is in line, but the probability of working is assigned to individuals based on the estimates that we make based on our data set. So there are going to be people, individuals, who have features so that they are more at risk of losing their job, and this from a year-on-year basis. But also the months worked throughout the year are attributed. So maybe there is a student with a closed-end contract who's only going to work for a few months. So what do we do with this? In the past, within TDIM, but this can be done at any time, we simulated different types of legislations in terms of unemployment benefits. So in the previous version, we had a pre-Fornero labor reform regulation, then the post-Fornero, and then the current one with the Jobs Acts. And within the model, because we had in situations of individuals who lose their job more frequently within the same year, they work 9 years, then 3 months, then 9 years, then 3 months off. And I'm thinking about the precarious worker in the public administration. By testing the several types of schemes, we had a chance to see what type of a system would better cover these needs or these situations. So this is an old exercise, but we can carry it out again. Perhaps replacing NASPI, not perhaps with the Fornero, but with a new proposal for an alternative system. And as far as the recourse to policies, I don't want to take up any time from the roundtable, because precisely this is more related to the final users, well, the ministry in its various departments, and we as developers, we tend to focus more on technical aspects. I'm giving the floor to Stefano. I don't want to monopolize the floor, to see if he wants to add anything else, and then I will give the floor to Professor Mazzaferro. Thank you, Riccardo. Well, I will try and give some answers to some of the issues that Professor Figari raised, and I thank him because he gave us great food for thought. And I entirely agree the need for making a greater effort on the topic of tax evasion, and also in connection with the need for being a bit clear in on the topic of validation, internal and external validation. But I want to stress something concerning reweighting. In fact, we do not calibrate the results of the simulation of year one. All marginal distributions for which we calibrate are inputs from the base year. This is something I wanted to underscore. As to the inclusion of cadastral income, we were asked why. Well, we included it because I wasn't aware of the fact that cadastral income is not imputed rent. So thank you for this consideration. As far as differences are concerned in the chart concerning revenue income, Riccardo answered. I include zeros, whereas Riccardo doesn't also consider equivalent income. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Carlo Mazzaferro.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I would like to share my presentation. Just use the button at the center. I may share it if you wish. If nothing has changed. No, I changed my presentation. I'll send it to you via email then, and then you may share it. Okay. Just a second. So, I fully share many remarks made by Francesca, and on the one side, it is quite impressive to see the number of data and the quantity of information within this model. But I wonder, and in this connection, I like to limit my analysis to the aspects linked to the pension system. I wonder what type of model, or better, how to include TDIM within the models estimating long-term pensions in order to understand what can be done through this model. So in this connection, by also referring to what I said in my slides, which hopefully you're going to share, by making a general classification, there are three types of models that can be used in order to assess long-term effects of a pension system. And each one of these models has pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, and better suits to assess a few things and less to assess other things. So, of course, there are models that can be, for instance, reflected in an Excel form, like representative individuals. So, for instance, work for several years and everything is linear. So this type of approach and setup allows to develop several types of indicators, and it has the advantage of making the comparability more immediate. So if I want to compare a system before and after a reform, or if I want to compare the suitability or adequacy of the Italian pension system versus the French one, just to make an example, then at the beginning I may use this type of model, these schemes, right, which have the advantage that are easy to develop, easy to discuss, and only measure the initial effects of a reform, but have no heterogeneity and no macroeconomic base, in the sense that the macroeconomic hypotheses relating to, for instance, the information to determine pensions are not there. Then there's a second type of model, which is a cell-based model. And in this case, well, they start from the averages. And they are characterized, at least from my point of view, by a number of approaches, and they try to shape the supply side, or at least they have an aggregate production function which does not exist in the macro simulation and in the representative models. So what are these models for? They are useful when you want to test as financial sustainability of a pension system, and also the ratio between the pension expenditure and the GDP. So when you want to check the aggregate cost in the medium to long term, against disadvantage coming from the idea that there is an aggregate production that generates this approach. But these models, however, have no heterogeneity when it comes to the population. So when there's the attempt to assess the distribution approach, they have to develop a sort of representative cohort of individuals. So all of the comparisons, so either intergenerational and intergenerational comparisons, are quite limited. And the last group of models, that is to say, the one within which we have the TDIM, includes a major point of strength, that is to say, the possibility to assess the redistribution aspects that have to be interpreted, and of course this is an aspect which surprised me quite extensively, both in terms of intra-generational analysis. That is, say, I take individuals from the same cohort and see what happens there, and intergenerational analysis. That is to say, I compare individuals and cohorts that have different ages. So this is the point of strength, but as it happens with the two other types of models, they have a weak point. The weak point, in my opinion, is that they have actually no supply side, and they depend on alignments. There is the external information which may keep the medium to long-term dynamics and, however, this is a rather, let's say, strong position, and in the final analysis, these are models that are difficult to use when you want to make comparisons. I don't know whether my slides are being shown. No, we are actually displaying them. Okay, next slide then. Okay, TDIM belongs to the third group of models, and some steps forward were made because the model is quite steady and stable, and there's a complex system, to some extent too much complex, I would say, but the general impression I had, also on the basis of the slides, and I believe that final report is even deeper. But my impression is that, as a matter of fact, there's no attempt to entirely exploit the potential of the model. What does it mean to exploit the potential of such a complex model? It means that you have to be aware, and this is the case, that the results from the micro simulation mainly depend on two things, that is to say, on a large number of hypotheses and also a broad quantity of data sets. The fundamental aspect then is to try and understand how it is possible to live with this complexity And also, in my opinion, this is very much important when results are presented. So complex models that require the presentation of a set of indicators. And therefore, we need to understand what are the results depending upon whether this is an indicator or if they depend on the data set that generated that particular situation. So, in my opinion, it is important to use on the one side a broad set of indicators, and to do so, and I believe that in the final report that will be included, and to have an extensive debate on the options, because this is a probabilistic approach, and here I refer to something that researchers take care of. I would very much focus on the analysis of the hypotheses that lead to the determination of the likelihood of transition, because this is based on a probabilistic approach. So please allow me this difficult attempt to put together behavioral rules. Well, this is something that I do not fully share. I do understand that having a behavioral rule is important when it comes to a general economic balance, because that is important to, for instance, define the consumer choice. And but in essence, this model seems to me that in its evolution is led by, let's say, probabilistic transitions. So I would be less worried about including a behavioral approach within a model that is a probabilistic one. So I'm quite provocative, if I may. You are more interested in producing academic papers, and therefore this becomes important. And if the goal of this goal is a policy one, then probably the behavioral aspect can be replaced by a scenario analysis. Let's move on to the next slide. In the rest of the presentation, though, I wanted to focus on two indicators, the two main indicators. There's an aspect which is not particularly clear to me. And actually, there's a continuous decrease up to, let's say, reaching 50% in 2050. And it is as if in 2015 up to 2025, the old pension system is still accruing, and seniority retirement is increasing as well. And what I expected is, as it happens in the dynamic between the average pension, average wage, well, that there was a sort of increase in the replacement rate, and then, of course, a reduction rate. And this is the first item that you may just deepen afterwards. The other important aspect, the gross replacement rate is a non-complete approach, because it is a single period approach. And for instance, the GDP on the one side, and the increase in wages on the other side, and then the seniority at retirement age. So it is important to try and separate these effects and these factors, and to understand which one is impacting on the rate. Otherwise, if it is put then as a monolith, it is not helping to understand whether in the future the Italian pension system is going to be suitable or not. So since you have this information, you may also exploit the information on the rest of the income, hence developing, let's say, household-related approaches, or those that take into account, for instance, wealth and the gross rate, for some categories and not for the entire population. And another interesting aspect, if we wish to use the replacement rate, is to try and measure the ratio between the amount of the pension of an individual and also in some benchmark indicators like the average pension and average remuneration in not only in the first year of retirement, but also in the subsequent years. And this is important in a system as the Italian one, which is an indexation approach which is absolutely limited. And another aspect I'd like to submit to your attention is to try and split the population by percentiles and also analyze how the replacement rate changes in income distribution. So it is like saying that the replacement rate is not a particularly useful indicator. Then, well, this is somehow clear through this slide, where the rate is calculated by considering, for instance, the seniority and the retirement age. And if I make a sensitivity analysis and see what happens, for instance, if the growth rate changes within the wage or if the GDP changes, which is implicit in the pension system. But you see here that, for instance, the lowest value is 47.7, and of course, sensitivity analysis as regards this information would be useful. And in any case, in my opinion, we need to be aware of the fact that the replacement rate is an easy indicator to describe or to comment upon, but it's not complete. So it has to be cited by a set of indicators that help to provide a thorough description of what happens, although we only intend to look at the adequacy of the system. Next slide. Here I have a chart describing the rate, and you see the values, past values taken from research I carried out in the last few years. And what is interesting here is to, for instance, present the distribution of replacement rates, workers retired, through averages. So if you have the entire distribution, this is what we can do. Next slide, please. Okay, the progressivity of the pension formula. So if I arrange the population by income centiles, then I can study, for instance, the progressive situation related to a formula. If I see that the replacement rate for the bottom of income distribution is higher, then I understand that probably some forms of redistribution are included. And what you see here in this slide mainly depends on the fact that here we have several pensions. And what I expect is that through the NDC approach, we have a proportionality. But this is something we need to check. Then another thing we can do is, for instance, to consider the replacement rate only for those that retire the same age and for different levels of income. So this is another way for checking the intergenerational redistribution of a pension system. And of course, this is a retrospective data. But nothing prevents us from using this form of analysis and also the related model, which of course has the same heterogeneity we have in an administrative panel. Next slide, please. Another aspect, which in my opinion is very much interesting and that should be assessed and considered and which has to be related to the Gini analysis, well, the indexation and the distribution of pensions shows that if I have a ratio between a pension paid today, when you see in zero, and one paid several years ago, up to 30 years ago, then with the passing of time, the new pensions versus the old ones, and which are paid in the same year, have different amounts. And this depends on two factors, that is to say, the previous growth which falls within the amount of the pension, and the way in which pensions, the existing pensions, were indexed. So these two aspects, and next slide, become fundamental in the moment in which we analyze Gini. For instance, when it comes to pensions, we put together pensions paid in different years. And of course, they have to take into account different situations. So there's one aspect which is very much interesting, that is to say, try and separate the impact of the indexation from the fact that the new pensions have a higher amount. And also, as to Gini, is the fact that in the slide you presented, Gini, when it comes to incomes, is lower than Gini on pensions. This is quite surprising, because as a principle, Gini should be lower. A few years earlier, so in my opinion, this is a methodological approach that is suitable to see. When we measure Gini with pensions paid in 1 year, and then we calculate the Gini related to the incomes, then we have an impact on the specific pensions paid. The very last aspect that surprised me, and maybe in the final report there's additional information in this connection, and which allows me to refer to the fact of using the model for what the model is able to do, is that you have not fully explored the time-related aspect of the model. That is to say, if you, for instance, include new populations, you have a panel where you may study, for instance, pensions in a given year, but you may also consider the situation of individuals in their life cycle. And from this viewpoint, a pension system is a system that, from the distribution standpoint, has to be measured also with a time frame. That actually varies. So actually, why aren't we using this dimension by using things like, for instance, the net present value ratio, or the internal rate of return, or the lifetime tax rate? So information is there. So what are these indicators for? They have to measure, for instance, the intergenerational distribution of resources, and what is the implicit tax that future generations pay. Well, it's the present value ratio that allows me to say it. And on the other side, since a pension system in the long term is equal, then when it's one, then I have a clear situation relating to the financial situation, and then I can understand what are the pension liabilities and also how they relate to the contribution activities. And then my final slide, this one. By calculating the net present value ratio, all the individuals that retired from 1995 and 2019, almost all the population analyzed as a value ratio higher than 1, and then in terms of sustainability of the pension system, that was not the case. So these analyses, in my opinion, and also in terms of future perspectives, may help to provide a thorough vision and view of the distribution situation of the various reforms implemented. I stop here, and I apologize if I was too long. Thank you.
So I will try to conclude in just 3 minutes. We are almost on time. I just wanted to specify that the final report is still far away, in the sense that this is an intermediate workshop. So I think that the final report is going to be issued in January 2022. So that is why the results that we are showing you now are still being validated, and they're not even they haven't been really explored in terms of indicators. So we, of course, want to take as much advice as possible in order to include all these comments, particularly the most financial related comments. We want to introduce it. Sometimes we think more about theoretical models, but of course you can do that as well with actual simulations. I agree with the limitations of the replacement rate as an indicator. As far as result is concerned in terms of decrease in growth, well, the expectations you had about replacement rate is what we look at with the aggregate replacement ratio, and the comments made are more in line with the actual result that we have in terms of aggregate replacement ratio. So the new pensioners that arrive are better off than the old ones, and so they raise the mean value, and I am happy to see that this value is actually in line with the observations. Of course, the replacement rate has got limitations, and we did try to limit its role to a comparative aspect. So what is the role of private pensions? We look at replacement rates mainly for that, and then we thought of adding these objective indicators, so the relationship between the first pension and the integration to the minimum. But we focus on the first, the main pension, and also because we implement indexation, and there too we could have policy scenarios within different indexes. It would be interesting to look at what happens, because indexation, as it is implemented in the Italian system, has an equalizing effect on pensions as we move on over time, because 100% indexation is recognized to less well-off pensioners. As I think I have touched on the main things I wanted to say, so I thank you warmly for your food for thought. I don't know if Stefano wishes to add something, because we've got 10 minutes. No, actually not. Well, we love you for this. Okay, so we can conclude this third technical panel. Thank you, discussants, for your contributions. It would be good also to get in touch later on to see how the model is developing, and then on the occasion of the last conference. I want to give the floor back to Irene to launch the fourth and last panel. So we now move on to the round table, which is going to end this intense day. So I'm not going to take up any more time, and I'm going to give the floor right away to Ottavio, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, thank you. I give it back to Riccardo for a moment. I was disconnected for a moment. Perhaps Riccardo wanted to recap the first 3 sessions. Is that what you wanted to do? Yes, I haven't done that yet, so I think I can do that now. I'm going to take up 2 to 3 minutes also to allow people to get back into the meeting, or those who were unable to follow the entire workshop. So to start with, Riccardo Barbieri, Sebastiano Fadda, and Giuseppe Ciccaroni reminded us about the meaning of the MOSPI project, so the need for delving deeper into the analysis of the Italian social security system based on demographic change, evolutions in the labor market, and also the economic and health crisis that is ongoing. So this analysis had to be deepened in order to consider the current policies, considering different sensitive scenarios, and also to propose new policies. And so, a roundtable which follows is going to play an important role. We presented the TD model in the first panels, its history and structure. We described micro data coming from IMSS, ISTAT, Finance Department, the SHIY survey. We looked at the structure of the model, then we focused on the migration model, and then we looked at two technical aspects concerning reweighting and the use of information coming from tax returns in order to correct IMSS information data on the income of self-employed workers. Discussants helped us place our model in the international scenario, and then looked at aspects concerning alignment and calibration of the sample. In the second panel, we started from the labor markets, and we first looked at our micro data sets, what they tell us in terms of dynamics within the labor market. Then we looked at the modeling of the labor market within TDIM in terms of transitions among different occupational status and income salary dynamics. And we looked at the differences that come up in the case of pensioners, workers, student workers, gender differences, immigrants and their occupational status. Then we looked at the wealth module, which is the main innovative aspect in terms of the modules included in TDIM. We said that also house wealth is considered, and in this case we referred to the Department of Finance cadastral data. And then we looked at financial wealth. This was mostly based on SHIW, and also we looked at the relationship with COVID. And the third panel we just heard about the third panel, we spoke about the pension model, the tax benefit model. We looked at the structure, we looked at the main results. And I don't think I have to add anything else, but what has come up from the discussion in the third panel was the importance, on the one hand, to delve deeper into the topic of validation. So we are actually implementing it. And also the need for clearly identifying the research model, or the research goals of this model. We have looked at technical aspects, but we are now giving the round table the task of proposing future developments for this model. So I hope this is going to facilitate the debate, and I'm giving the floor to the round table. Thank you, Riccardo. This session is mainly devoted to simulations concerning policies, but not limited to them. But the discussants can feel free to also get back to any of the aspects that were dealt with during the previous three panels in order to provide additional food for thought or discussions. And this because perhaps some simulations, which are potentially very interesting, may be carried out only if we made additional changes or improvements to the model. At any rate, with reference to simulations, I would like to focus again on the fact that even though there are gray areas, there are mainly three of them. So simulations for validating the model, which are useful to develop the model, look at its properties, and identifying the baseline. Simulations of sensitivity simulations, where you can see how simulations can react when basic hypothesis change of the demographic type, productivity growth. And also, these simulations really are a first way to put the model under stress, under pressure, and see how it can react. We spoke about stock return, for instance, which is a constant over time, rather high ones, and we said that there are no risks, no differences among the individuals, but there is also a macroeconomic risk component. So we could hypothesize that in 2025 there may be such a shock that there is a fall in of the stock exchange, drop in financial wealth. The point is that in this case, we need a connection with a macroeconomic model that can explain how many other variables would react, underlying variables. Otherwise, it would really be meaningless, in the sense that from an economic standpoint, it would be meaningless to have such a simulation. And then there are also policy simulations in which, and the speaker apologizes, I get back to these sensitivity simulations. For instance, we can see how the various systems respond depending on a number of control variables. So if there is a crash in a stock exchange, then we can look at how the Gini coefficient is redistributed in such a scenario. Now, as to policy simulations, well, we can perhaps carry them out by, for instance, altering the institutes that were modeled within the model. To make an example, for instance, we look at the parameters based on which the minimum income is developed or processed, or we alter the behavior of one variable which has an impact on the model's results. We were speaking about financial education, literacy. So if we increase financial literacy, then what would happen? So variables, hypothetical variables that we could vary over time for a given reason. The second part of my contribution, which is not going to take up anybody's time because Mr. Barbieri, unfortunately, is going to be in a meeting, I think, with the minister, so he's not going to participate, and therefore I'm using part of his time. So I want to get back to something that he mentioned. In other words, he was speaking about various development directions for this model, based on main guidelines. We were already thinking of improving some aspects concerning, for instance, retirement choices, by introducing an element of choice, whether to retire before or afterwards, and further improving, let's say, choices concerning how to allocate the wealth of households. And secondly, we can also assume or think about not just improvements, but also we could also reconsider the demographic module, and we may focus on processes concerning disability or morbidity or related to conditions that lead to disability, and many other aspects that can have an impact on the projections we make. And last but not least, there is also a much more long-term scenario for 0.05.0, and therefore further expand the dimension of social protection, and this time on the side of the services offered by the public administrations. So look at the healthcare sector, but not limited to it. For instance, childcare and many other aspects. It could be interesting to develop models on them, looking also at the interaction with the models that we already have in our directorate, but also looking at other institutions and other departments at the Ministry of Finance. I would like now to give the floor to our discussants, whom I'm going to briefly introduce. I just wanted to remind everyone that we are also interested in suggestions in written form that you may wish to give us. So all participants are invited to give their contribution. Also, in terms of suggestions, you can, send them via email in the future if you want. So the discussants are Michele Raitano, whom you have already met because he moderated one of the sessions. He is, among other things, an expert in the welfare sector and also on the topic of inequality. Then we have institutional representatives, but this is not, of course, to be intended as a criticism, but for instance, Maria Teresa Monteduro, who works for the Department of Finance. She is, I think, in charge of research, and I apologize if I am mistaken. Then there is Marco Cacciotti, State General Accounting Department, who has already taken the floor and who studies pension-related aspects, is responsible for that, or long-term analysis concerning pensions. Mr. Dr. Ambrogio Rinaldi, whom I wish to thank once again for his cooperation. He is a member of COVIP, and Professor Daniele Cecchi from the University of Milan, who, among other things, deals with labor market, but he has also studied aspects related to education. I think that Professor Cecchi, asked for the floor, and I would like to grant it to him, and then we will have the other discussants take the floor according to our agenda. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your observations. I didn't ask to speak first. I just said that I'm going to leave at 5:15. So as a chair, you are going to be very strict. We can, simply keep to the order that you have on your agenda. Oh no, we don't want to run that risk. No, I am the one who changed the order precisely to make sure that your contribution, would be left out in case you had to leave. Well, I wish to thank you because today I learned so many things, and can I simply share a quote? I don't know if you can actually see my computer, my screen on. Yes, we can see your screen. So this is to tell you that the starting point for me was this. This is what I highlighted. This is the noble speech of Sir Richard Stone, 1986. And this is more or less the level of knowledge that I had in terms of my background before I listened to today's discussion. And this is to say that I've learned so many things today. And maybe some of the comments I'm going to be making maybe an overlap, so please be lenient with me. And the first thing that I was particularly interested in, and that which also worried me a little, was the issue of transition in the labor market, so that employment probability which you have been estimating, in which there are some demographic features, but there is no market signal. So we can believe in neoclassical economics or not, but a useful instrument that I would have expected to see illustrated in this model was the elasticity of labor supply as related to salary. Also because this is one of the greatest feedbacks when we look at the issue of distribution. People replace the fall in salaries with more worked hours or less worked hours, and then men do something while women do other things. This, at the heterogeneous dimension, I think is important if we want to make distribution analysis. From what Carlo Mazzaferro said, well, what I've gathered is that these models are not closed, so there is no equation in this sense that establishes a variable that somehow acts in retrospect on the choices of individuals, but this is particularly important when we want to use this tool not just to make long-term projections, but also to analyze some policies. And some policy, by this I don't mean that we just change the parameters of the marginal rate, or that we define an audience. Some policies, by some policies, I also mean that we are extending or shrinking the retirement age, reducing the retirement age. And unless we've got market shutdowns or closures, this can, in my opinion, to a certain extent reduce the reliability of our forecasts. Another example concerning, for instance, training or educational choices, there is a deterministic model that replicates the generation of the parents on the generation of the children. Well, I fully understand, and no doubt 30–40% of variance can be explained well, in this type of choices, depend on your family of origin. But one thing is analyze a cross-section. Another is keeping this as a model for training choices for the next 30 years. I simply do not believe in it, or at least I would ask that, even assuming that Italy remains socially stable for 30 years, at least a retroactive effect in which the return of human capital is determined endogenously by the model seems to me to be a useful deepening. And likewise, I don't believe that people are going to choose a partner in a deterministic manner. So if we look over time at the correlation between the revenues of spouses, we've seen that there have been big changes. Of course, we have no idea how assortative mating is going to evolve, but this type of social behaviors taken as stable for 30 years, well, something that I am not so sure about. Also because, to a certain extent, individuals react. So look, a strict critic on the long period is de facto valid. Well, a second comment that was already made by a discussant, but I cannot remember who it was, the professor from Tor Vergata. Well, when there are deterministic transitions, and therefore probabilities for changing one's state or status, if you include some noise, it's not always the same people who make the object of a transition. So if this is the case, well, these forecasts must have some standard errors in them or around them. So when I look at a substantive phenomenon, which is that of the dynamics of inequalities in richness or wealth, I have to understand if we are looking at the U-shaped Gini dynamics. Is this something I actually believe in, or is this a standard error that becomes so wide that it can, reach any point? So these are, reactions by a person who's not an expert, who has been listening to your contributions. Then, looking at the various contributions and after having taken a look at the slides, it seems to me that in the projections presented, there is a convincing overall picture. And this convincing overall picture is that Italy is facing a problem of growing inequality in favor of elderly people and to the detriment of young ones. This was said by the Bank of Italy a few years ago, but projections, I think, have been confirming quite evidently this type of picture. And so implicitly, the policymaker should be asked to provide an answer concerning how to carry out an intergenerational distribution in favor of the youngest generations. And de facto, the private sector is implicitly carrying this task out by making transfers from parents to children, but this is unequal from a social standpoint. And that replacement rate, which was criticized by Carlo Mazzaferro, that goes from 80 to 50% over a 30-year period, well, it must contain a number of very strong assumptions to be able to show such a dynamic. But even though we took as a face value that type of dynamic, I wonder what is the effect I should be expecting, and set against this wealth that becomes more concentrated and the replacement wealth going down. I think there's a social issue that is going to erupt before 50 years have elapsed, because there are going to be huge inequalities within a population that is marked by different degrees of dependence on a production base which is shrinking. And as a consequence, at least in the narrative of this report, I would highlight, underscore this direction in terms of analysis, because on the one hand, we take stock of what is sold in the various parts, and on the other, because it is a way to give value to the conclusions. A last thing I wish to say is that as far as tax benefit policies are concerned, I am not so sure about the hypothesis that a full take-up rate comes up. Well, over the COVID period, we have had some examples of a take-up rate which all exceed 100%, because self-employed workers have made a comeback who had not contributed for years and years. But in general, any measure it takes up between 50 and 80%. So at least I would look again at these percentages. And then I would add that because this model is so full of, is so rich, I don't think it's so difficult to correlate the take-up rate with the educational level or the household dimension. The territorial dimension, we heard, is still something to be explored, because to a certain extent, this is also showing the granularity of predictions in light of the information that is available. Thank you for your attention. This is all for me. Thank you very much. I think it's a good idea to condensate, to give our answers at the end. And I would like now to give the floor to Michele Raitano. Thank you again, Ottavio, and thank you for organizing all this. I am really grateful because this is so interesting. I will try to briefly illustrate 5 aspects, which I'm not going to speak about the advantages or issues with this type of models. Also, Michele before me spoke about them, but I wanted to look at some sensitivity scenario and policy scenarios that we can imagine developing at the end of the project, based on some limitations or issues that are related to the Italian welfare system, particularly the pension scheme, also in connection with some long-term dynamics. The first aspect I wanted to touch on was also mentioned by Riccardo Conti during his presentation, but in general, continuing to reason on the assumption of that people retire as soon as they reach the retirement age or they meet the requirements, in my opinion, and I want to be honest with you, is just wrong, and it's biased also in terms of the policy implications we'll want to look at. We don't know what people are going to be doing with the contribution-based system. We can partially start seeing that because as of 2012, a part of the pension is based on contributions. So, and this, of course, is something that is growing. This is really hidden information. If I were the labor minister, I would make a huge survey to try and understand what people want to do. Because if we continue to carry out reforms, thinking that we've got huge cash, if we look at retirement age by including disincentives, we run the risk of making a mistake, because we see that with the quota, with the 100 quota, expectations were much higher than the reality. But we do that also with Opzione Donna, where the number of women who take up this option are very few. No doubt the upper voluntary system can already explain a lot, in the sense that very few people took advantage of this. So we have to evaluate things on the long term. I know that you have been reflecting on this, but perhaps this should be a base, well, the baseline should be different. This is very important for labor market dynamics. There is no one-to-one replacement between pensioners and workers, but this is something that could have an impact. And also in terms of distribution dynamics and amounts that fall in the replacement rate that Daniela was referring to, of course, depends on the fact that we are at equal occupational life. We are making people retire as soon as they reach certain requirements. Also, seniority decreases from the slide you showed us. And this is something that is relevant, and we should reason about it. So my suggestion, my advice, policy advice, is to think carefully, considering all these elements, also based on the limited data that we have concerning those who opted for the various options, also the 100 quota. The policy options, well, I've often said that based on what I just said, we continue to talk on when to have people retire and leave this quota 100 quota system, when with lower incomes people postpone retirement. They don't want to go to retire early when they see that their pensions are too low. Of course, based on this, we could decide not to make pension or retirement age so flexible. So this is another policy scenario that we could also simulate. A second aspect, which is a problem in our pension system, is that for years we thought we based our assumptions on the contribution-based model as the right model, which does not mean social justice, however, for all the reasons that we looked at. And the first aspect was already mentioned by Riccardo and by many of the previous speakers, and there's differential mortality, which is not included in the model, but this is a suggestion I'm making. It should be important to introduce it, even with some brutal hypothesis. If you cannot make estimates. But with Daniele, a few days ago, we participated in a very interesting seminar in Turin that shows us the huge difference in terms of life expectancy, leaving, health aside, but still it's very impactful. This is the case of life expectancy on the various values, etc. So also in this connection, sensitivity scenario with differentiated life expectancies is something that we could consider, also assuming that all those who have a higher number of years or certain type of education live a number of years less than other people. So this is our hypothesis, a brutal one though. And then there should be a policy scenario with some differentiated retirement requirements, and this in connection with the previous point. A second dimension, policy dimension related to actuarial fairness is shown by the data that we have at our disposal. Some analysis had also carried out during the intermediate report, IMS data are quite shocking. Before this presentation, I looked at some data, the LSI data, that show us people who started with the new system in 1996 for 20 years. 50% of these people, not public, state or self-employed, but 50% of these people over a 20-year period have accumulated less than they would have accumulated if they had always worked by earning 12,000 euros for real every year. So this, of course, opens up very important policy scenarios. In this picture, another important element for simulations is this huge growth of part-time work, which is gray, but for pension purposes, retirement purposes, it makes no difference because contributions in the contribution-based system are paid according to the scheme. And this is something that the private scheme cannot really help us, because these people will not be able to help to accumulate contributions with a private pension. So this is something that also came up in a recent interministerial meeting. We can call it, we can refer to a basic pension in a different scenario. I don't know, whatever, but we have to think of something and structure it. The new government will go on in this direction. A policy scenario I've been suggesting, again, to imagine a neutral model from the standpoint of the public finances, is imagining a funding system internal to the system. I pay 33%, you calculate my pension on 31%, but 2% goes to a fund in which I agree to pay my money. That will, give me an additional option. This is an additional element that we can simulate. Another sensitivity scenario linked to limitations is that all these limitations can be exacerbated if we look at all the things that we have been speaking about in October 2019, where we could still meet because it was pre-COVID, the first meeting of this project, when we were speaking about the long-term scenarios or technological progress. And I can add to this also the recovery that is going to come post-COVID, which is not going to be neutral. So from the macro perspective, there could be great impacts on the employment market, etc. But what is important is also an increase in inequalities in the labor market that I was referring to, as far as contracts are concerned, part-time work, salaries. And so in this case too, there are sensitivity scenarios that should imagine different dynamics. They are important for this.
As regards private pensions, well, we continue to have some, let's say, bias, especially in 1995 when private pension had been included in order to supplement public ones. But in consideration of the reforms in 2010, well, actually, as a university professor, if I, for instance, decided to join a private fund, whatever option I considered, then the replacement rate would be exceeding 100% with a public pension already. So with a private pension, it would be much higher. And therefore, from this point of view, the role of the private pension changes. And personally, I'm not a supporter of this approach, but we can easily imagine, let's say, scenarios in terms of opting out. And also, there's another important item I'd like to consider. That is to say, in a model that, for instance, deals with distribution, anything that relates to variance as well as average, and we should consider a an issue relating to system-related consistency, because living such system entails a number of transition costs, but in a model that simulates up to 2070, and we have a number of trends for the earnings relating to the private pension, well, we should consider alternative options, and we don't do that because all of the literature tells us that there are risks of different type that have to be compared, and therefore having a little bit more of information is relevant. And yesterday I was talking about that with Ricardo. So something we should do, and I remember the private pension should be considered because the gap in terms of participation is somewhat premature, especially when they are supplementary ones, and therefore we have a tax adjustment, especially in pensions, and therefore we have sensitivity options relating to the distribution as well as the rates, that is to say, those that are involved in these options, and as I said in my contribution, and also policy-related scenarios where the opting out, in order to understand those that would get advantage out of the situation, having considered that private pensions are somehow remarkable. And then something like what was said by Carlo, but the struggle here is quite relevant because, of course, we are considered that the replacement rate in our system comes out of a system which has an insurance goal. So in this case, the replacement depends on a set of options. And as Carlo said, from this viewpoint, this is also a suggestion for the policy, that is to say, to try and rely as in the lowest possible way to the replacement rate, because this entails a distortion and considers, for instance, indicators that are other than, for instance, the social allowance. And finally, if I consider the tax benefit, well, this is something that I support. And of course, as it was said by Daniele 5 minutes ago, I'd like to refer to some results that Giovanni Carlo identified. And we carried out a number of joint activities as well. So as to the citizenship income, either because the information is not careful or because we have some gaps when it comes to the underground economy, but the gap is 70%. It actually increased during the COVID crisis. But from this viewpoint, actually, it is necessary to take into account the fact that personally, I am always more scared about the idea of estimating complex requirements or such as the citizenship income or other ones in the very long term on the dynamic model. But of course, in this case, I rely on your knowledge. So thank you for this stimuli that you provided us with. Thank you so much, Michele. And so there are 10 items. You said 5 actually, but I counted 10. Yeah, actually, item 2 had a number of sub-items. That is the truth. Okay, next. So I give the floor to Maria Teresa Montedura. Thank you so much also for inviting me to participate in this workshop, because the model and the presentations were definitely interesting and also full of food for thought. So I'll try and make some short considerations, in particular relating to the suggestions that I got from the presentations, and also with possible, let's say, uses from the institutional standpoint, and then from the references to the possible scenarios, and also to link this new and important tool to other ones that we are generally using. However, before that, I'd like to congratulate those that participated in this project. And I think we of course, need to consider also the portion of migrants that have an impact on the pension system. And also, it seems to me very interesting how actually this information was used. Especially when it comes to the self-employed workers, and also the various situations relating to the real estate, and also, for instance, the cadastral rent and the data used to estimate the portion of, for instance, family and household wealth. So also, very interesting was the fact that, as we said, there were several items that were included in terms of tax benefit, and also, for instance, the family allowance, which is going to be introduced as soon as, for instance, this is going to be included. And of course, this is also linked to the deductions, and it will entail some changes also from the point of view of for instance, tools linked to children. And it's also very interesting and quite impressive to see the efforts made to integrate and supplement databases in order to use matching procedures. And of course, it is not possible to adopt the statistical information we have. So it seems to me that the model is today much more innovative than in the past. And also, this is one of the features that I need to stress, is the because this is a new aspect also relating to takes into account the heterogeneity of the approach, and also this new version of TDIM, it avails itself of let's say macro founded data. So for sure, in identifying let's say that in the future and also, as Michele said, also well, this might provide a lot of information, and I'm thinking about, for instance, how to better structure the social mobility phenomena. And also, for instance, Daniele Checchi was underlining this fact, and also that they, for instance, can be considered as stationary versus the ones of 10 years ago. And also, if we consider the taxpayers' data, well, a number of analyses were carried out that try and trace back, no, I wouldn't say the career, but rather the evolution, the social evolution of taxpayers, and they are identified according to their surnames. Hence, Mr. Rossi, the famous, let's say, Mr. Rossi, has developed in the last decades, and of course the archives may provide additional information also in consideration of the social mobility phenomena. So of course this is an important aspect, and it characterizes and makes the model attractive from the theoretical standpoint. And also, the bottom-up approach can be still more emphasized in terms of flexibility, as well as improvement, and then a degree of heterogeneity, and also possibility to, for instance, implement the regulations in force on a sample that represents the population, or a sample that is representing the population, but better weighted in terms of heterogeneity and the segments of the population. So, if we move on to our policy simulation approaches, which are, in my opinion, possible so far. Well, from my point of view, a possible scope, which is particularly interesting, is the one that refers to the inequality indicators also in the long term as to the tax benefit. And I share actually with the previous panelists the concern of using a macro simulation model within the medium to long term, especially and also from the tax standpoint, because in the moment in which, for instance, we have no, for instance, behavioral reactions, well, it seems to me quite difficult to make, let's say, tax-related simulations in the very long term, mainly because taxation is something that changes the behaviors of the population. So first and foremost, we should define a model in terms of behavioral reactions through behavioral modules. But of course, the distribution effects of, for instance, specific payment models are relevant also when it comes to the long term. And of course, they can represent a main trait, especially if we, for instance, move from an approach in which within the economic policy debate and relating to, for instance, the long-term sustainability of pensions, the central aspect was always represented by, for instance, the macroeconomic compatibility of pensions and social spending, and whose dynamic, of course, in the future will be impacted by the aging of populations. Well, at the same time, there's a model that relates to a main goal, that is to say, the evaluation of the suitability of public policies, as well as considering that suitability can be considered in terms of assessment of the distribution effects. And also, a suggestion, well, that comes to my mind, comes from the indicators that we are developing together with the Treasury in order to assess the development of the sustainable, just to consider the sustainable goals. And I'm thinking about income inequality indicator because, of course, following the pandemic, this is one of those areas that are difficult to evaluate. And the main reason for that is that the shock affected in a heterogeneous way the various categories of subjects by affecting, of course, self-employed workers. And what we saw is the main difficulty to update the income structure and not to reiterate policies that may either improve, for instance, the inequality situations, but the incomes are not the same as the pre-COVID period. So this is important because the TDM model tries to develop the segments of the population, and then it is possible to continue to develop and consider the heterogeneity of the segments of the population according to the evolution of income. So this is going to be particularly useful to simulate a number of, let's say, scenarios for the distribution profiles of the tax benefit system. And in this case as well, in the next few years, the department will be at your disposal in order to draft and fine-tune simulation and sensitivity approaches, as well as the, let's say, longitudinal panels of taxpayers, useful in order to focus on the characteristics of some specific cohorts of the life cycle of a given portion of the population. So a cohort that needs to be followed is the one of the self-employed people. And in fact, we had some data relating to the self-employed people, and it seems to me that this is particularly interesting, also in consideration of the professional career of these people, with a view to considering the pension system. So, and of course, the the other taxpayers may opt for a simplified taxation at 15% up to 65,000 euros. So these aspects can be further be supportive for the model and be used in order to develop for those subjects their pension careers. The other aspect that comes to my mind, and which concerns the aspects related to, as it was mentioned in a specific panel, relating to the financial wealth, which now represents an important element, which is which needs to be focused, as it was said this morning. In fact, the only source available at the macro level is the survey made by the Bank of Italy, which is affected by the end reporting problems. But in this connection, in the next few years, it is possible for us to provide some contributions in terms of analysis by allowing this information to be used, especially when it comes to the financial reports. And also, they don't need to be matched with other surveys or sources of information, at least on the basis of the tax code. It's not excluded that some ad hoc processing can be made, and that this processing can be done in order to better weight the wealth of some segments of the population. So this activity is certainly appreciated. It has to be continued, and on our side there's full availability, both at the level of in-depth analysis on some scenarios that may have to simulate and better perform the heterogeneity of participants, and at the same time to have a number of scenarios and policies with data that is also administrative data, useful to make simulations increasingly strong from and by decision makers. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now I give the floor to Marco. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I'm particularly grateful because I actually followed your works, and I followed the entire, let's say, activity. And I know well how huge the efforts are, and I was impressed by the results obtained. So all of these evolutions and progresses can definitely be shared. Also in consideration of other scenarios that are increasingly important when it comes to the use of specific policies. But before going ahead, I have some slides, and I don't know whether I can share them with you. Can you see the slides? Yes, we do. So, I understand that we are dealing with a situation of macro simulation, so we need to consider specific indicators, but maybe it is the case of setting the framework. The Italian pension system, which is now based on the shift from one system to another, well, this allows to sterilize a portion of the demographics. I heard many people saying that the aging of population is something that is already, let's say, part of our activity. And in the future, the dependency rate of the elderly is going to be higher and higher. Despite of all that, the Italian pension system has a benefit ratio that remains among the highest ones, in this case, the highest one in absolute terms. So these are the latest results of the AG report, and I got the permission to share this information with you. So the benefit ratio is among the highest ones, and this is due to a mix. That is to say, the passage to the contribution-related pension, and also the transformation coefficient. What this allows to have benefit ratio and replacement ratios, as you can see here, that are on average high. So these are the results that we include, and they are based on a self-based model. So from a different point of view, they are validated. So what actually I have not clearly understood is why the analysis on the Italian pension system is not relating to, it's just stopped at 2050. Because 2050, as to the demographics, is a year of transition, basically. Maybe it would be more useful to exploit, let's say, the entire set of data up to 2070, just to see what are the results in terms of adequacy of the Italian pension system. And once the contribution is at full blast, it's possible to further evolve it. So another important thing that I wanted to share with you concerns the fact that there's a link between the, for instance, the transformation coefficients. Well, this allows to stabilize the transformation coefficient over the time, and this is a useful characteristic. So if we think about the recommendations by the European Commission, which represent the basis to access the recovery funds, well, I wouldn't go beyond this type of adjustments in the reform of the Italian pension system. And these analyses are the same ones as those carried out by the OECD. So on average, it is necessary to work for several years and to participate in the labor market for a longer period of time and try and stabilize the period spent at work in the activity that we carry out within the General Accounting Department. We carry out some activities. I'm not sharing this information with you. But here we find some results that, on average, are very good in terms of forecasts. And in consideration of my experience, how do I see the team? So one of the things that definitely needs to be extended is the labor market, also according to what I said before. That is to say, we have 3 to 4 years of huge opportunities from the point of view of the reform of the labor market under the recovery plan. So a tool, of course, like TDIM and the SILK is very much useful to improve our awareness on how we can introduce a reform in the labor market or in the Italian pension system. I'd like to linger on one fact in particular. That is to say, I found some results that deserve some clarifications. For instance, in a slide, there was a relevant drop in the self-employed people, but then this was not reflected in the transitions. If you see the transitions of self-employed, then the component 1 or 2 years later remains stable, around 0.9. So this is something this is important in order to consider the thoroughness of the presentation. As regards I see TDIM as a model that can provide satellite information, and then it may be considered as a way for testing the efficacy of a number of policies, but with an ex-post approach. As regards the scenarios that should be simulated, while one, in my opinion, concerns the impact of insurance. So we are in a situation of pandemic and we have a growth which is and when we move out of the block to dismissals, there will be a number of unemployment subsidies, and we need to see how the additional contributions So this scenario has to be analyzed. And I very much appreciated the part relating to tax benefits and all of the other policies and social policies. And I wonder, what are the measures adopted and also the latest decree and the very last thing I wanted to say is that we've talked a lot about validation of the model by using the dynamic. And I don't think this is an easy strategy. And of course, this is not an easy strategy. But with the passing of time, the validation risks to require more time. And of course, in terms of pension reforms, we had at least one per year. So the team would undergo, or does it work under the team would undergo a huge stress. I think I've covered all of the items. So basically, as far as I'm concerned, these are my messages. That is to say, to focus on the labor market and to leave the pension system aside. And this is also told out to us by the European Commission. And also, that was it. Thank you. Okay, so we can move on to the next speaker, which is Ottavio Ricchi. Oh no, then we also can give the floor to our colleague. Can you hear me? Okay, so good evening. I'm Bad Rinaldi. Good evening. No, we cannot hear you. Let's try and speak without the video. Yeah, that's much better. Okay, I had the feeling that there was something wrong with my camera on. Okay, so I go back to some of the things I was saying. There's this issue relating to supplementary social security in our pension system. And in fact, Michele was mentioning the very last reforms, so the Fornero reform and the previous one, 2010, 2011, with the life expectancy being adjusted. Well, they had sort of increased the expected replacement rate, and also the role of supplementary pension schemes. However, I believe, and I agree with this statement, that this cognitive misunderstanding, that is to say that it is designed in order to represent something for all, which many people consider, and then this does not happen in reality. Well, unfortunately, when it was decided to define supplementary pension schemes as additional to the compulsory one, also from the point of view of contributions, 33% of the contributions to compulsory social security is the highest rate at the world level. And so, thinking that anyone may reasonably and rationally add 10% to this amount when it comes to social security, well, this leads to a level of transfer of consumption which is totally irrational, and in most of cases it is irrational. So I believe that with 25 or 30% in terms of participation in supplementary social security, we should be more than happy. So it seems to me that this is already an extraordinary result, and probably from the policy standpoint, it is not clear that, well, this is desirable from the point of view of public policy, being it a goal or an objective on which we may invest. So essentially, the system, the supplementary system is now something strong, and in fact, we have a lot of data that we gather and which confirm this. And of course, the workers with the highest income and which have a stable condition, men, somewhat old, from the central to northern Italy. So it is clear that the supplementary social security is an approach that becomes useful and becomes affordable in case of the protected, let's say, groups of workers. Having said that, well, this has an important implication, from my viewpoint, as to the importance of supplementary social security in your model. Because if your model is aimed at considering the adequacy of pensions or of the welfare, generally speaking, and also might be considering the low, let's say, brackets of the population, as to the low groups, the supplementary pension systems cannot be of any help because it's not affordable for them. And of course, this is our first element. We certainly need to reason and also on how it is worth to invest on this and in this sector. So in such a situation and against this background, whilst on the one side I agree with what was said by Michele Retano before, I would say two things. One is that we need to make, for instance, an opting out. So 33% should be, well, a portion of such amount should be taken from the compulsory to the supplementary social security in order to have a diversified portfolio in terms of social security benefits. And then with the growth perspectives of the Italian economy, for merely demographic reasons, are not so extraordinary, well, maybe for young people, this is somewhat exceeded based on your model, in order to have a role that is different from the one that it presently has, and which shall not be somewhat exceeded from the adequacy standpoint. And if we, of course, forget the rules on contributions and the role of social security contributions, if we include a number of modules relating to the variability of income, well, this is a useless investment. Because, as I said, it would entail a variability component that it's not the one you have to work upon. They are not the ones that entail adequate or less adequate pensions. We're talking about people that already have adequate pensions. So I believe that investing in that area with all of the related problems and also from the computational standpoint, well, this is a non-promising investment. And something I like to do this confirms the fact that the role of complementary social security can be marginal, but the only thing here, and the one that entails a particular message, is the one that showed that over the time, supplementary social security, or the consideration for complementary social security, increases inequality, because the Gini index, instead of decreasing faster, and instead it is somehow slowed down by the supplementary social security. And therefore, it's important to consider this with a little bit more of attention, because I believe it depends on the fact that for these people, which I'm describing as sound people, the fact of participating in supplementary social security is the result of a shift of saving from financial forms into social security forms, and not as an additional saving. So I believe that if in those charts you also included the income from financial activities and not just from the complementary and supplementary social security, then, of course, the inequality that seems to come from those areas, well, it will be substantially cancelled, because then you have a rather negative message when it comes to the role of complementary and supplementary social security, that from this point of view, I see it probably as too much. So the result obtained so far on the participation of supplementary social security as a tax expenditure, that is to say, the quantity of resources and also the taxation and revenue from taxation that you put aside with the supplementary pension schemes. Well, it is possible to think about use of the tax expenditure on a supplementary social security different from the one that we are using nowadays. For instance, the 5,000 or so euros in terms of threshold can be used only by people that, for instance, and as we said, you can afford. If you earn 30,000 euros per month, what do? Are you really adding 5,000 euros to that? That looks like an amount that is devoted to those that have quite a high, let's say, income. So there's no regressive approach here. In some countries, we have the matching contributions. So if you support and contribute to the supplementary social security, the state gives you the same percentage in your pension accounts and your pension fund. And this creates a sort of belonging that you feel. But as a matter of fact, it can be given and placed at your disposal in a fairer way. And to the brackets of population that have adequacy problems. That is all for me. And I apologize for being too long, although I was the last speaker, which is always a problem per se. And I thank you so much. You were great. And I would now just speak to Irene. And maybe are we taking a few minutes for feedback? Well, apart from those that have other commitments, we do have actually some time, 5 minutes for some questions. And I hope we still have Professor Keki, whom I thank. And a few things he said were actually mentioned again. So this is a problem we cannot. We are aware that this type of module is not so suitable when it comes to providing endogenous responses and answers. And this is done by scenarios. So with macro scenarios, you imagine to use some types of responses. And we considered the possibility to introduce some aspects of this type in the labor market, but actually they are not among our priorities, although these are important things as well. There's then an issue relating to intergenerational mobility, or aspects that have to do with, for instance, the level of education, because the level of education depends on one's parents. And this is deterministic. So a possible correction is that of adopting a non-deterministic rule, but rather to have a variability. So if, for instance, people say something, then it is also possible to introduce a variability, and this variability item which would represent the endowment of the individual, well, then this might simulate these aspects, where exception made for the fact that this mobility will change and may change over the time. So how to capture this aspect, and if an interaction exists with some covariance that we might use. For instance, the role of a covariate varies in time. But this is an aspect that we somehow might talk about. Then the full take-up rate, we are aware of it. It's possible to do something, let's say, like aligning, which is the easiest thing to do. And we know that in 85% of cases this happened, and this is going to be done in the future as well. Or, as Maria Teresa suggested, we can do a better job, and we may see, for instance, when it comes to administrative data, we need to check information on individuals, or if the take-up rate is a function of characteristics of the individual. I have to say that I would tend to answer less to the speakers from the Ministry of the Economy and Finance. And in any case, many of the things said were somehow considered. An aspect that was mentioned on several occasions is COVID. And these questions or jeopardizes our model, because on the one side, our starting point might be wrong, because we are starting from 2017 and we adopt a given behavior, but then we actually find ourselves in 2021 with, for instance, self-employed workers that are different from the ones that we projected. And it's not just a matter of level, but rather our transitions, we need to check whether they're still valid. And unfortunately, we don't know that. So we might do some alignments at a macroeconomic level. And until microdata is not available, it is difficult to check the behavioral aspect and approach of transitions. Another thing that we noted, as Marco said, is the fact of not considering pensions. Obviously, this is not our main focus, but our model, as he knows, well, because he knows it well, highlights, for instance, spending pressures. And the benefit ratio if our rate is better than other countries, well, this doesn't mean that in some scenarios, especially after the COVID situation, well, maybe we may have a sustainable pension spending, although the pressure and the gap in terms of redistribution and the level of social security provisions, well, maybe they're becoming even more unsuitable than they presently are. So it is important to have new scenarios, therefore. I wish to thank Ambrogio the things you were saying are definitely important when you need to further validate the model. You were talking about the fact that the supplementary social security seems to worsen the Gini index. What you say is correct, but in terms of validation, we need to see what this depends upon. And of course, we're going to keep in touch. And we're going to further assess those aspects and what is the role of the third pillar and you suggested, for instance, to make some interesting simulations. And I guess this is aimed at fine-tuning the Gini index, but we don't know whether the role is fundamental or not. Of course, the model somehow allows to add or remove some tax benefits and see which one, to what extent each one of them contributes to the Gini index. I don't know whether someone else wants to take the floor very quickly. In any case, I'd like to thank once again all of you. And I believe that the expectations were very high in terms of contributions to be given today. And I believe that expectations were even exceeded. I don't know whether, Riccardo, you want to add something? I heard Marco Cacciotti, he was mentioning the possibility to extend from 2050 to 2070, that's correct. And we're happy to see the availability of Maria Teresa and the finance for the future, because I'm sure that that is going to be an area where we're going to push further. And as to the rest, I'm not going to steal any additional time. We have a lot of food for thought already. Irene, you have the floor for your closing remarks. Thank you. Well, this day has been definitely interesting and full of comments and information and suggestions, which I'm sure will provide huge support to the continuation of our analysis and will lead to the drafting of a next report on the basis of what was done so far, and then also a fourth report, policy report, that will be presented during the very last conference that will take place next December. So at this point, thank you. Thank you so much, and see you. Hopefully I'm going to see you next December 2021. And I hope to see you in person and to meet you in person. And that this negative period is over, and that we can, of course, organize a final conference worth of this name at the Ministry of Finance, of course, which will host us on that occasion as well. So thank you, and enjoy your evening, and see you soon. Bye. Thank you. Bye.